Thanks very much, Fred. It's nice to be back at the Institute. As Fred said, I don't know if I'm leading up much of anything at the State Department, but I'm certainly helping out through the end of the year. And so along with that comes the disclaimer that anything that's in the brief and anything I say here today is my views only and certainly does not reflect the views of the U.S. government or the United States Department of State. Or necessarily the views of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. This was a really exciting project. The model that WBCSD and the companies included developed is unique and let us test out some policy scenarios when it comes to this question that up until now have been difficult to do. I'm just going to walk through some of the findings of the brief. Today, there's a lot of data in there, which I'm not going to dig into. It's all laid out fairly well in the policy brief, and we can cover it in Q&A if that's interesting. So, as Fred said, buildings are important. They're important in the U.S. It's the largest and fastest growing source of energy demand. Residential and commercial buildings are now more than 40% of U.S. energy demand and use. That's more than transportation sector and faster growing than the transportation sector. It's not quite as significant today in developing countries, the building sector, as it is in developed countries, but it will be soon with China urbanizing 150 million people over the last decade. They've got to add about 2 Bostons a year worth of built environment to take care of that. And the decisions that are made about commercial and residential buildings in emerging economies today will help determine what an energy future for those countries look like. So it's an important question from an energy standpoint, which means, of course, it's an important question from a climate standpoint. As Fred mentioned, the G8 in Hokkaido in 2008 called on the world to reduce emissions 50% below current levels by 2050, and that goal was reiterated again this year in L'Aquila in July. The IEA has done probably some of the best long-term modeling out to 2050 of what the technology mix to make a goal like that possible would look like, and they published that in their energy technology perspective. And this chart pulls from the 2008 energy technology perspective, where they kind of divvy out where the reductions would need to come from. And so they see building sector, which is at about 8.8 gigatons of CO2 today. That's both the emissions that come from a building specifically. So I live in New York, and we still use fuel oil in my apartment building, and so there's direct emissions from burning that fuel oil. But then, of course, there's emissions from the electricity you consume in a building, but they're not emitted on site. They're emitted back at the power plant supplying the power. So if you couple both of those two things together, you're talking about 8.8 gigatons. The IEA projects that'll grow to about 20.1 gigatons by 2050. That'll be about a third of the global total under their projections of 62 gigatons in 2050. That's compared to today, we're at about 28 gigatons of CO2 emissions. So a 50 by 50 type of goal would mean cutting global CO2 emissions to 14 gigatons by 2050. So that's a 48 gigaton reduction. And in the IEA's estimate, that would require 8.2 gigatons of reductions from the building sector in the form of improving efficiency, so using less energy, and that you'd need about another 9 gigatons in terms of reducing the carbon intensity of the energy that's actually supplied to buildings. So both less energy for buildings and less carbon intensive energy for that energy that's supplied. What we're interested in is the direct side, the efficiency side, the 8.2 gigatons. And how much it would cost to get those 8.2 gigatons of reductions from the building sector, and what are the barriers to actually getting that done. There's been a lot of work on building sector emissions in recent years, most notably cost curves like this from McKinsey, which show that in the building sector, in terms of improving efficiency, there's a lot of profitable opportunities. So for those of you who haven't walked through a cost curve before, and I'm sure that's no one in this room, everything underneath the cost curve has a net positive rate of return on the investment over the life of the investment. So that air conditioner pays itself back in less time than the actual air conditioner lives. And investments above the cost curve don't quite pay themselves back unless there's a carbon cost, which is measured on this side here, the abatement cost. So, so you look at this line here would suggest that investments in pastoral afforestation come at a net CO2 cost of about $10 10 euros a ton, I guess, $10 a ton on this slide. So these types of cost curves have been very powerful in suggesting that we can go a long way towards meeting our abatement goals at no net cost. But they also raise the question, if there's all these profitable opportunities to improve efficiency and reduce emissions, why hasn't anybody taken advantage of them? Why is that $20 bill still sitting on the sidewalk and no one's picked them up? The other question is a lot of these individual components, when it comes to efficiency, interact with each other, right? So if I install insulation in my home, it's probably going to reduce my heating costs, but it could possibly increase my air conditioning costs. And what the WBCSD model allows us to do is look at whole building choices and look at an end goal of getting to 2/3 reduction, up to 75% reduction in the per square foot energy consumption of a building. What would that cost, and what are the mix of technologies? George David's going to talk through the model more when he comes up after, but they have over 1,000 different types of building designs included, and it's a behavioral model. So you can set consumer expectations about rate of return on their investment, barriers to adoption, and then see how far that actually gets you, which is fun for us because it allows us to tweak some of the policy scenarios. So what if you put in place a cost of carbon? What if you change the payback expectations that households have? How much more efficiency can you get? And then we use the technology costs in that model to see what the overall investment expense would be. We took the per square foot estimates from the WBCSD's model for residential, single-family residential, multifamily residential, and commercial buildings from the 6 subregions around the world that they assessed. And we scaled that to IEA projections for floor space growth in the residential and the commercial sector. And so this is IEA projections. Oh, now I've done it. Right, there we are. This is kind of straight line projections, which of course reality won't be straight line, but for simplicity's sake. Building sector emissions going from about 8.8 gigatons today up to 20.1. That's the IEA's business as usual scenario. Now, the WBCSD model projects actually a more aggressive rate of learning under a business as usual case than the IEA does. So we end up with a building sector emission total of about 18.5 gigatons in 2050. This is what the IEA is looking for in terms of building sector reductions at about 12 gigatons. When we run through the WBCSD model's transformation scenario, we get down to about, in terms of direct emissions, down to about 9 gigatons. And that includes in the WBCSD model a lot of on-site renewable generation like solar panels, which isn't necessarily included in the IEA's analysis. If you get the ability to sell surplus solar power back to the grid, then it gets you even further emission reduction, so you're down to about 7-8 gigatons, which leaves about 5 gigatons left that you would need from the power sector in terms of switching the energy that's actually consumed in buildings from high carbon to low carbon sources to get your total reductions from 20.1 down to 3 gigatons from the building sector. So that's a lot of numbers right there. For comparison's sake, we wanted to look at just what an 8.2 gigaton reduction would cost so that we could stack that up next to the estimates from the IEA for other sectors. And this is a table, you'll find this in the brief, that kind of lays that out. The long and short of it is that globally, to get that 8.2 gigatons of reductions, it will require an additional investment of about $1 trillion a year globally on average between now and 2050. It sounds like a lot of money. It's about an 18% increase in the energy-related investment under business as usual. That investment number is a little bit higher than some of the other estimates had put forward, and there's a couple reasons for that. The WBCSD folks have continued to evolve their model since we did the assessment back in April and are showing, I think, slightly lower investment numbers now, and George David can perhaps speak to that. So that's the upfront cost. Now, about $200 billion of that in the U.S., given our projected growth in the building stock. The energy savings from that globally to meet those final goals would recoup about 83%. There's some things that would pay back in a very short period of time. There's other investments to get to that 8.2 gigaton goal that wouldn't pay back over the lifetime of the product and would come at a cost of carbon, a social cost of carbon of about $25 a ton globally. $25 a ton out to 2050 is more expensive than some existing studies of the building sector have suggested, but it's still less expensive than getting comparable emission reductions from other sectors. If you look, this is from the IEA, from the same IEA report. This is their kind of cost curve, just a notional cost curve, where you have end-use efficiency being negative cost, power sector being kind of modest cost, and then transportation sector emissions reductions being at the kind of higher end of the cost spectrum. The assessment from the WBCSD model still puts building efficiency, particularly some of the early investments, down at this side of the cost curve, on the cheaper end of the cost curve. It brings us back to the same question that's raised in the McKinsey work of particularly for those abatement opportunities that are supposed to be profitable right now. What are the barriers? How can we alleviate them? And what are the costs if we fail to actually address the barriers to getting those 8.2 gigatons of reductions from buildings? And so what we did is we kind of mapped out, if you didn't get that 8.2 gigatons from buildings and you had to make it up in other sectors to still be able to get to your 2050 goal, what would it cost you? And if you had to do it from the power sector, it's going to cost you an additional $708 billion a year globally, right? So while building sector emissions reductions out to 2050 are a little bit more expensive than we thought, they're still cheaper than the alternatives, and failure to catalyze those will make climate policy significantly more expensive going forward. So then we got into the really fun part, which is testing out what the mix of policies to alleviate those barriers are. And we started by throwing in place a carbon price. Now, for the whole package of emission reductions in the building sector, we got an average price of carbon of about $25 a ton. So we started by throwing in a $30 a ton price into the model, and of our 8.2 gigatons, we only got 0.6 gigatons of reduction. And here it's kind of broken out by region. Now, the reason for that is because it's for the very reason that those things are underneath the cost curve right now, that households and businesses have very short payback expectations when it comes to investments in efficiency, either because they have limited capital or because they don't have good information, or if you're like me and you live in a multifamily residential building in New York, I don't have any ability to improve the efficiency. I mean, I can change my light bulbs to compact fluorescence, but I can't change the kind of guts of the building. The owner has to do that. Owner doesn't pay the electricity bill. I do. So those split incentives prevent the kind of investments in energy efficiency that you would need to see those types of improvements. You have the same type of split incentives in the commercial building space. And for residential buildings, where the owner has the ability to actually make the improvements, sometimes that upfront cost is too large when you have competing interests for your capital, like sending your kids to college or paying down your mortgage. So even if it makes sense as an investment, you have limited capital and limited information. So what some folks are looking at in policy, and what we kind of modeled here, is what if you can extend those payback periods by giving financial intermediaries with longer time horizons and lower costs of capital access to those efficiency opportunities. Now, in the residential sector, that could come in the form of your utility investing in efficiency in your home for you and capturing some of the benefits, sharing those benefits with you. In industry and in commercial buildings, it could come in the form of energy service companies or direct access to the capital markets to fund specific energy-related investments. If you manage to change the time horizon from 5 years, which is the base case in the model, to 10 years, you get an additional 3.9 gigatons of emission reductions with the same carbon price. So change in the cost and the availability of capital is an important piece. But that still doesn't get you all of the way there. To get your full 8.2 gigatons, you need building codes and standards because a lot of the lifetime of this equipment is beyond 10 years. It's 20 years for some of these equipment investments, and it's going to be difficult to get private capital to finance that. And so if you want to take advantage of those cheaper cost of emission reductions for the society as a whole, you have to come in with standards. To cover that kind of gap, the standards gap, if we're looking at the U.S., for example, up here, we're talking about $100 billion or so a year if you're trying to get to the full emission reduction potential. That's about a 10% premium over property investment projections in the U.S., but you'd get it all paid back over time with a $25 a ton carbon price. You compare that to things like fire codes, which impose a 5% premium on property investment, and it doesn't get paid back at all with energy savings over time. So these are all pretty manageable numbers with good long-term costs. Making those investments is important, particularly in a world of climate policy and rising energy prices as a result of climate policy. This is modeling here recently from EIA of the household energy expenditures that would result from the Waxman-Markey Climate Bill, H.R. 2454, which tracks business as usual fairly closely and then goes up a bit towards the end. So if you're looking at $300 billion under business as usual of household energy expenditures in 2030, and under climate legislation, seeing that grow to maybe $325 billion, you can more than fully offset that cost increase to households through investments in efficiency. What I did here is I took the per square foot transformation for residential that comes out of the WBCSD model and applied it to the U.S. housing stock, and you can cut U.S. household energy expenditures from $300 billion to $150 billion, even with climate policy in place. Programs like cap-and-trade bills, like the Waxman-Markey bill, provide resources in the form of allowances that can be used to help catalyze those efficiency improvements and ensure that higher energy prices resulting from climate policy don't translate into higher energy costs for households.